next up, we've got a double act, so 2 for the price of 1 with these 2. So we've got Dr. Stacey Emmonds. So she's a reader in sports performance at Leeds Beckett University. Has done a lot of work in the collaboration with the football, working on projects looking at athletic development, injury prevention and match characteristics in elite youth male and women football soccer players. Also has a lot of applied consultancy roles. She works with the women's under-19s physical performance coach and the UEFA, as well as a lot of other things. She's a very busy woman. And then Fieke, another very busy woman. So Fieke is currently a senior lecturer in sports coaching at Leeds Beckett University. She's focused more. She completed an undergrad and postgraduate degree in psychology with specialization in clinical psychology in the Netherlands. I can't pronounce the university word, so I won't say it. Then on completion of her master's, Fieke went on to do a postgraduate and PhD here at University of Leeds Beckett, and has also worked at Edinburgh in a various number of roles too. She's also my supervisor, so she's pretty good.
Too much praise. Not sure I can live up to that. Right, welcome. Me and Stacey, double act, have tried to combine the topics of physical and psychosocial maturation and to try and show you some of the interaction between them and why they matter to you in your roles. Before we start though, we felt it might be nice to make the session a little bit more interactive. So I'm going to ask you to have a look at the post-it that is on your table, to follow the instructions, and you have them. Once you have done that, 30 seconds to find a person either next to you, behind you, to try and make pairs, and you've got to tell that person who you are and get across really what you're all about. Right, if you've not swapped over yet, it's definitely time to swap now.
Always spends money.
Thank you. You need to follow close to that, otherwise you're definitely going to overrun by a mile. Thank you for engaging with that. We will come back to this in a minute. I'm now going to hand over to Stacey, but I hope you enjoyed these doing yourself, if you didn't already.
Okay, so what we're just going to briefly start is, I guess, just clarification just on a few key terms I'm going to use throughout this talk. So obviously within school settings or any kind of youth sport setting, we generally sort of group adolescents by chronological age, which is obviously referred to on the left. However, as we'll expand on it throughout this talk, and I'm sure many of you are aware, there's a lot of things going on from a biological perspective, and there is a need for us to probably be considering those youth participants from a biological maturity status. But a challenge we often see, or sometimes confusion, lies in these terminologies. So we talk about chronological age, and we know how that sits, and we talk about within the construct of chronological age, relative age effects. So obviously if you are born at particular time points in the year, what quartile you sit in. And sometimes there's confusion between this quartile, relative age, and biological maturity meaning the same thing, and they're not, they're different. So just as probably this diagram then shows on the right, you can have somebody that sits in a particular quartile, so quartile 1, but he's actually a late physical developer still, and someone who's quartile 4, who will be deemed younger in that age group, but he's early, so they could be actually closer together. So in a lot of sort of what I talk about moving forward, we're going to talk around this biological age, and probably the importance of considering that, given a range of both physical and psychosocial things that are occurring. So what we're going to try and build upon, there we go, is a lot around this sort of peak growth period, which is referred to as sort of peak height velocity, where we have this period of accelerated growth within youth athletes, which has a lot of factors that may impact from athleticism. What we tend to find, though, in a lot of literature, and it is growing, but it's still very limited, and definitely in coach education resources that are out there, is when we talk about this, we talk about the male athlete and the youth male. And we talk about, and you may have heard a lot around, we select the early maturing boy and he's more athletic and these kind of things. And these concepts have been taken over to working with female athletes and presuming, well, this is youth athlete education that we talk about and these principles must apply. But what we know is that's different, and it's different due to what we call the timing and tempo of maturation, but then also the hormonal changes that are occurring within the body during this period. So if we look at the graph, we can see just from a timing perspective, girls start this process younger. So girls will generally start to go through this period of accelerated growth, more around 10 years. And then in boys, we start to see that process occurring around 12 years. With that, we then have considerations for the timing and tempo of that. So the timing is where we're referring to where that process is about to start. And then the tempo is how long it kind of takes to go through that accelerated growth period. And as we'll expand on further into this talk, the time it takes, the tempo, can also have huge implications, again, for athleticism and, importantly, injury prevention. But we can see that sort of this period of peak height velocity, we have this huge growth spurt that is around, depending on the athlete, and it's going to vary, but 7 to 10 centimetres in a short period of time. And then that's followed by what we call peak weight velocity, which is an increase in body mass, which can then be anywhere up to around 10 kilos, depending on male versus female over that following 6 months, which again can have impact on athleticism. So again, from working with these age groups, if we're working in this sort of 10s to 16s and even beyond that, we need to be monitoring these periods of growth. And generally we would advise that that is sort of monitored sort of every 3 to 4 months. As we start to see a participant going through this period of accelerated growth, then we might start for a short period to do that monthly just to track the tempo of that, but the importance of considering this when we're working with this group. So from a maturity consideration and trying to differentiate again between boys and girls and just expand on that. So when boys go through this period of this accelerated growth, and we have many changes going on, obviously not just physical, and Fieke will expand upon those, but boys have this increase in testosterone and growth hormone. That's associated with some positive athletic development qualities. So they not only are getting taller, longer limbs, important for things such as speed, but they have this increase in natural development of lean muscle mass. That's going to underpin their ability to develop a number of physical qualities. And that's why we tend to see these early maturing boys selected into talent development environments, or they may be perceived as the best in their age groups in any kind of context. And they may be still from a technical tactical perspective as well, but are we almost misinterpreting this early athleticism? For girls, we actually see the opposite. So not only start this process earlier, but due to some of the more female-specific sex hormone changes that occur, so increase in estrogen, progesterone, that's associated with actually an increase in fat mass. And then what we know with that is we get a decrease in strength. Now, strength, obviously, from a relative strength perspective, underpins also a number of other physical qualities, also underpins our ability to generate absorbed force, which relates to injury. And we actually see as girls go through this accelerated period, I'll show you some data further into the presentation, we often tend to see either a plateau or decrease in physical capabilities. That has implications for how we train them and what we're doing during these periods. But again, if we're also talking to sort of talent development environments, it's understanding that, and almost the opposite of boys, making sure we're not deselecting them because they're no longer athletic, or we think they've maybe lost interest in sport and have found other reasons. So these are kind of key considerations, and just really wanted to highlight the difference from a physical perspective during this period in boys and girls.
Thanks, Stacey. Right, it's not just physical things going on in adolescence. There's also a whole bunch of psychological and social things going on. Now you can finally touch the things that I put on your desk. You can use the beanbags, you can use the balls if you have them. You're going to put the ball up if you agree with the left side of the statement. You're going to hold the beanbag up if you agree with the right. So let's have a little go. Typically, adolescents tend to take risks or can oversee the long-term consequences of their actions. That's a ball. Okay. Typically, adolescents are disorganized or can plan. So disorganized balls up, they can plan and organize themselves with beanbags. Okay, a bit more mixed. Adolescents typically are egocentric, balls, or focused on others, beanbags. Next. Okay, good. Typically, adolescents like to stand out, balls, or are easily embarrassed, beanbags. Right, okay. Typically, adolescents crave independence, balls, or need structure or want structure and guidance. You've got a good strategy, you're holding it both. Right. Typically, adolescents have good self-control, balls, or struggle with self-control, beanbags. Right. Thank you very much. I do not have time to come back to individuals in the room, but we will see why I picked these statements quite deliberately. They are a person who figured me out. I was holding up both these things all the time. Did a brilliant job. Right, so if we think about adolescence from a cognitive and brain development point of view, it is a time for significant growth, okay? Adolescents get to the point where their thinking evolves in a way that they're now able to think abstractly, they can hypothesize, they can start to plan, they can start to organize, they can start to think through long-term consequences of their actions. They can start to evaluate themselves in a much more sophisticated way that develop the ability to really take perspective, okay? But at the same time, this is how we think about adolescents, right? So they are better at planning and organizing and thinking and hypothesizing, but equally, they're like this person that can get away with taking lots of risks, right? And how that works is because in adolescence, that ability to self-regulate, to control your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviors, to stop yourself from acting on impulse is quickly developing, but it's not peaking until probably the mid-20s. However, the part of their brain that is incredibly sensitive to the good feeling of taking risks and sensation is peaking much earlier in adolescence. So that's really rewarding to them, and their ability to kind of stop that from happening is only getting there. A bit like a car that has all the equipment, but the brakes don't work so great yet. Okay? I have to say, how many of you came in the room and thought, there's balls, I'm going to throw them, I'm going to pick them up, I'm going to do something with them? Oh, that's very modest, thank you, James. You know, you're all hopefully mostly past that point, so you've developed good self-regulation skills. I bet if I put them on the table with a group of adolescents, those balls would have not been there by the time our presentation started. Is it quite that simple though? Right, so there is a test that is done in psychological research, which is called the BART task. And the outcome of that task is very much related to real life risk taking, like drugs, smoking, all of that kind of stuff. I did a similar task. I'll explain what it is. Was it a Wellington festival? All the good rugby players across the country, they come for a whole weekend. 10 academies, every group I sat down with, the majority stayed in the room and said, let's all blow up balloons as big as they can be. How many groups do you think managed to keep any balloons intact? None, thank you. But when I did ask individual players to go blow up those balloons in the hallway, they all came back with a giant balloon not burst. Right, so what does that tell us? Is that actually adolescents are quite good at regulating. Self-regulation is pretty well developed by 15 if the context is not arousing and if their peers are not around, right? So when there's a really famous study where they got adolescents to sit in a car, not a real car, a kind of virtual experiment, and drive across a crossing with increased or less risk. If they were on their own, they made really sensible decisions. If their peers were in the car, not so much. So that tells us something about how important social evaluation is. And where does that come from? So I've just told you that adolescents are increasingly good at thinking about their own thinking. That also means they're increasingly good at thinking about what other people think. And that's a bit unfortunate. As you can see here, around between 15 and 18, self-reported embarrassment peaks. How many of you took the post-it off your forehead very quickly? How many of you thought, what a silly task? What's this woman doing? Sticking the bloody post-it to my head. Yeah? We are so embarrassed if it is in a room full of strangers. Adolescents, way worse, right? Again, so just be aware that they are easily embarrassed, particularly if they think other people will think something of them. Another quite famous experiment, I saw someone looking at me really hopefully when I came around with the last balls and I didn't get one. And I didn't leave a post-it for someone else. That was deliberate, I apologise. The point is, as human beings, we're incredibly sensitive to being socially excluded. But again, adolescents, particularly between 14 and 17, that's where that really peaks. Their mood is incredibly more affected if they are excluded from a task than younger teenagers and adults. Okay? So, right. That's Sarah Jane Blakemore. She's an expert when it comes to adolescence, teenage brain. What she's trying to highlight there is that adolescence is a time where young people, from a social kind of society perspective, have a number of kind of key developmental tasks to achieve. She's highlighted them very nicely. I went to the library on my own, independence. I wore yellow colored glass. I figure out what I want to look like, how I want to be portrayed. One of my friends, who I fit with, someone has a crush on me, intimate relationships, and all of those kind of things, right? That's what matters to them. So adolescence, from a kind of, we know this from literature, is a time where they're trying to establish independence. They're learning to manage relationships, particularly with their peers, but they might push against other authority figures, particularly their parents. They try to develop an idea of who they are and how they fit. They try to experiment to get there, and they're starting to plan for the future. I'm not sure we have time for this, but we'll go.
I guess very briefly then, I think just to highlight again, what does that mean and then what does it look like? I guess from a working on a physical perspective with youth males, this is some data that was collected in elite youth boys academies, and you can see who's sort of getting picked to play is generally this early maturing player, but actually are we kind of missing top talent? Because actually is this kind of player in the green there at the far side who is a late maturing player but still getting minutes, is that actually where our talent is? So thinking about in a boys context, how we're viewing talent, making sure that while these two players may sit within the same annual age group, we are considering them in terms of their own individual development and their own individual timeline, and that we're not comparing them against each other, which I've had experience before of coaches asking for the data just ran sort of who's the fastest, who's the fittest, and with no consideration for any of this. So that's from a working with boys perspective. This just briefly some data that's been collected by one of my PhD students for his PhD with Jake with the English FA. So we've worked with over 20 academies in the country from 10s to 16s and physically profiled them. And again, highlighting those points around physical development in girls and why there's a need to make sure we are putting considerations for girls into coach education and into PE curriculums and things, and it's not just generalised for all. Is again around two of these aspects. So as you can see, the trend line, which is obviously the line going across, when we look at equality such as relative strength, it pretty much just stays the same from under 10s all the way through and actually drops off as we go through this period of peak height velocity and beyond. We start to get this dip from some data not on this slide, but some other data I collected as part of the study that's on there. When we then start to then look at force time characteristics as well, so we in essence looking at their ability to generate force quickly, and we looked at their ability to generate force at 100 milliseconds. That also decreases around this period of growth for girls and beyond, which has implications when we talk about force absorption and thinking from an injury risk. And then also from a aerobic capacity, again, we see this decline, which again associate a decrease in relative strength, this increase in non-functional body mass, again has implications in what that's going to look like in terms of athleticism within whatever sport they're doing. So again, they need to consider this within what we're programming for girls. And again, linking to what Fieke said, the psychosocial implications of that and how that's going to affect them within those environments.
Yeah, so very briefly, Stacey's already highlighted that those physical differences often then translate into particular messaging to the young people. So it might be that you're talented or you're not so talented, or you're an athlete or you're not, maybe not going to be an athlete. And there's two key messages I want to highlight here, is that because we know that adolescence is a time where young people are particularly vulnerable to social evaluation, being seen to stick out compared to your peers is not necessarily a very positive thing. So there is a particular, when it comes to females, there's a study in Australia that's shown that adolescent Australian youth athletes were bullied for the fact that they were seen as talented and that they really didn't like that. There isn't much data, but let you listen to a little bit of this. That's a bit difficult to follow, so I'll just move it on. But that's a group of rugby players speaking about how they don't actually like to talk about the fact that they're in a rugby academy to their peers in school because they sound boastful and they don't want to sound boastful. So that tall poppy syndrome is not necessarily just something for women, but there is more research there. The other part of that is that those young people are developing their identity, and the messages that we give them, we already heard that this morning, they're particularly vulnerable to those. So we need to be careful that, one, we don't let them overinvest in being an athlete at the expense of other things that are going on, but equally that we don't turn people away from the sport when that really isn't necessary at all.
And then just briefly, just to highlight from an injury perspective, obviously this period of adolescence is when we probably see this acceleration in training load, maybe playing multiple sports, or if moving into more talent development environments, an increased frequency of training. So we have this increase in load and exposure at a time when we have physical qualities potentially plateauing or decreasing, and that is associated with an increase in injury risk. So again, data we've collected across the England talent pathway, big increases in injury across under 14, under 16 age groups, and that's reciprocated in what we're seeing in male talent development environments as well. So how do we better manage this period of adolescence with youth athletes? How do we prepare them for it? And how do we manage sort of load and athletic qualities during this period is key. Just to kind of bring that together. So we see here this rapid growth through this period of peak height velocity. We know we've tracked some data in the English talent pathway through another PhD student. We have an increase in physical demands even within the sport they're playing in. We see that again in recreational, whether it's recreational or elite. So as we progress through the age groups, the demands of the sport increase, but we have this decrease in tissue tolerance and quality during this period, and that is where we get this spike in injury rates. So despite probably that they're moving into these talent development environments during this period, we need to think about actually how do we sort of continue to develop them holistically during this period.
Thanks, Stacey. And then to tie that again back to some of the psychosocial, the risk of injury is further exacerbated by the messages that young people pick up, and particularly adolescents pick up. So there's quite a nice bit of research around adolescent athletes are much more at risk of not reporting concussions because they feel that it's not accepted in their peer group. They're much more likely to take physical risks, particularly when they have a strong athletic identity. They're much more likely to play hurt, again, because they think that is what's right and because they don't want to miss out on time with their friends. So if we understand what the adolescent brain is like, we might understand why they take more, one, they're more sensation seeking, but they also take more, engage in more risky behavior. Second part of that is relating to injury is actually that there's also lots of other things now going on in their lives, like they might have exams, life stresses, and they then further accumulate the risk for injury. So not just looking at it from a loading perspective in the sport, but also looking at all the other demands that they're facing.
So I think Well, we might start to see sport specialisation as we go into adolescence, whether that is an elite environment or recreational. It's really important that we continue to develop these general athletic qualities, regardless of what sport the participant is going to engage in, whether they are male and female, that we're addressing these. But potentially the approaches we take to these may differ, again, slightly based on gender, but again, more on biological maturity as well. And considering then, how do you go about that? Potentially, you know, you have a 20 youth athletes in front of you, you've got that one session. How can we maybe go about it? And here is just providing, I guess, one idea that maybe links to that is, rather than a one-size-fits-all prescription, is again thinking about maybe of a levels within an exercise. So if we're going after a specific physical quality or competency, how can we have different levels to that? It may allow within that same session the individuals, based on different, not just biological maturity, but also technical ability, technical competency, to be at different levels within the same session, and working on that, again, is probably going to allow a little bit more confidence. In some younger athletes as well, they can still progress, so they might progress in level 1 to level 2, while someone's 4 to 5. And what we also see a lot within girls, and I've seen this in elite environments as well at international level, is they don't like to compete against each other. It's quite uncomfortable, and particularly in these age groups. So therefore, by them being able to follow their own trajectory and path and be supportive of each other in doing that, that maybe also provides an opportunity. But then also linking to some of the points Fiekke's covered, the importance of trying to give them some autonomy within that, and an opportunity to express themselves and be creative. So obviously you can't do this within all sessions, but we are fortunate that we have Leeds United Girls Academy train here, and some of the work we've previously tried to do with them through education on, again, why they're doing a programme, which probably don't have too much time to go into this, but there's a whole other body of research around the girls want to know the why, and I think that's really important that we foster that. So we try throughout the pathway programme with these girls to educate them on what they're doing to get to us later in the season, giving them some autonomy. And I guess an example of them providing a bit of opportunities where they come in, some guidance from the coaching staff, can have some input and autonomy within. Bring it to life and give a bit of an example.
Honestly, our last 2 points are very brief, but I think we want to acknowledge that it's not easy to do this. Both in regards to Stacey's example, just there for just a program, but also thinking about more widely what we expect of adolescents. If you think about the fact that from a developmental perspective, they need to explore, they need to feel a sense of belonging, they need to develop their self-regulation, and they ideally want to be given autonomy. So them asking why really fits with that age group. At the same time, sporting, athletic environments often demand for commitment, for punctuality, for being organised, for being coachable, but actually it's in an adolescent's nature to rebel. So maybe we just need to expect some of those behaviours and work with them, and not necessarily punish them for them as such. So one of the things that Rochelle told me yesterday, what he typically does if he works with coaches about adolescents, is to always start by thinking, what would you like them to be like? And then what was it like for you to be a teenager? And go back to that. What was it like for you to be a teenager? And keep that in mind. Remember that their days, particularly if they're involved in sport, might look worse than this, and that their life is like this. All right? So if we can keep that in mind, I think that will help us. And that's us.
That was great. Thank you, guys. We have time for one question.
A bit of a one here, but given the negative impact of the fat mass accumulation in female athletes, coupled with the sensitivity to peer assessment and comparison, kind of have this perfect storm with female athletes where they don't necessarily want to be weighed, but that's probably quite an impactful metric. And if we don't do that, we can't be sure that's actually what's impacting their performance. How would you navigate that situation with that population?
Yeah, really good question. I think it's around the language for me. It's not around we are assessing around like body mass.
It's about actually we want to get strong, we want to develop lean mass, and you know how that underpins other physical qualities, and just generally being an athlete and using positive images of other female athletes lifting and doing those things. So if we are weighing and we're doing those kind of things, we try and keep, one, we only do it when it's deemed appropriate in terms of we're not doing it all the time. But again, the language is not around an assessment of fat mass. It's around measuring how much lean mass you have, and then how can we further enhance lean mass. Obviously, a byproduct of that is probably going to be a decrease in fat mass.
And I think Stacey might certainly do this, but I'd also think about where that happens, who might be in the room, who that data gets shared with, and how that's negotiated with them. How much buy-in can you get from the young person once you've explained what it is all about, how they perhaps become owners of that data and they bring it to you next time around instead of that data being somewhere else, if that's possible.
Do you think the fact that we treat that differently to all the other metrics we collect enhances the sensitivity to it? Because like in my experience, when we don't collect that, the next time we do, suddenly there's, oh, now we're collecting that. Whereas before, if that was the same with the accounting, room jump, everything else, it was just another metric we're collecting. Yeah,
I always use it just to not, I don't really report that as such. It's more just we want to make everything relative to body mass. So just say to them, hey, look at, you know, so-and-so, so-and-so, so you're all different heights. So obviously it doesn't make sense for us to compare you all the same. We're tracking you. That's when, and how can we support you on your individual development and journey? We're just doing this so we can make sure it's relative to you and your body mass, as opposed to kind of doing one arbitrary across the group.
Yeah, and I would add to that, but we might not have time for that, is that I would question myself about the other bits of measurements equally.
I know other people have got some other questions, but feel free to email them. They're probably going to hate me for that. Or grab them at some point. They might be around. I'm sure Stacey might have them people on.